All right, so we're live on Facebook. I feel I should say before we start, for those of you who weren't in the prayer gathering, you may be wondering why I look like this. I have an eye infection, and so I feel a little lopsided here. So if you're wondering, like, what is going on with Emily, that's it. All right, are you ready, Robert?
I'm ready.
Okay, all right. Welcome to Exploring A Course in Miracles. I'm Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement, and I'm here today with Robert Perry. And we are talking about a concept in the Course that will most likely be unfamiliar to many students, and that is the pull of God. This is a teaching that appeared in Course scribe Helen Schuckman's notebooks and also in the earliest drafts of the Course. The language pull of God was mostly removed from the original publication, however, and it has been restored in the Complete and Annotated Edition of A Course in Miracles, where you'll find it referenced in a number of the areas we'll be discussing today. The FIP edition of the Course still includes the concept of the pull of God, but mostly under the heading of the irresistible attraction to God. But either way, regardless of what you call it, it has never really been much of a thing in the Course community. This is a topic that has largely gone unnoticed, but Robert, I know the pull of God is a topic that has long intrigued you. This is one of those ideas that you've been hoping would take root in the Course community. So it's nice to be here discussing it with you today.
Oh, yeah, it's a beautiful concept. So I'm really glad to be doing this podcast about it.
So I guess we should just begin at the beginning here. What is the pull of God? You want to give us a definition?
The basic idea is that even though we are largely unaware of it now, we have an overwhelming, irresistible attraction to God. And that's what the Course means by the pull of God. And when we get in touch with it, it is absolutely overpowering. We can't resist it. And that's the basic idea, but there's a lot more to it than that.
Okay. Yeah, so we have a really, really powerful attraction to God, and this is different than how we tend to think of our pull towards God. We have a God traditionally that has been, if you've grown up in the Christian church especially, you have a God that is considered to be fearful by some. There's a quote in the Bible that says, "No man can look at his face and live." So it's really hard to be attracted to that. And then we also have in the spiritual community these days, the more contemporary spiritual community, the idea of an impersonal God. And there's something really drained in that God seems very, very boring. And so it's hard to kind of find our place. It's hard to understand this idea when we have these different concepts of God.
I think the latter is especially relevant for course students because lots of course students admit to feeling bored at the idea of being one with God. It feels like you're just floating in some kind of cosmic soup.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and a lot of course students wish they felt more desire for God. It's like it's an embarrassing thing that we don't feel more desire. We have all these strong desires and feelings in this world, and it feels like our nature is more geared towards connecting with the things of this world. And then when it comes to connecting with God, it seems like it's just not in us. We don't have the natural attraction.
Hmm. Yeah, that reminds me of one of the passages that we were planning to talk about today in chapter 4 of the course, and it describes the lofty impulse of the pull of God compared to the more baser instincts that we have. The quote says, "The threat value of the lofty is really much greater than the baser impulses to the ego, because the pull of God himself can hardly be equated with the pull of human appetites." So this suggests that the pull of human appetites is actually much weaker than the pull of God, although in these bodies, that's obviously what we feel far more strongly.
Right. So when we think of strong, overpowering drives, we think of bodily drives like sex,
Mhm.
right? And to think that that's much weaker than the drive we have to be with God, that there's a much greater pull to be with God, that's incredible. And I think the significance of it is that it not only is a different view of God, it's a different view of us. Because it's a view of God in which God is unbelievably attractive, right? And
Yeah,
attractive is not a term we necessarily associate with God.
and we're very accustomed to the pull of those baser impulses. We're accustomed to the pull of the refrigerator, to the
Right.
bedroom, to whatever. Like we
Yeah.
know those really well. This, even though the Course says it's our most fundamental desire, it's hard to get in touch with that.
Yeah, but it suggests that God, like a key feature of God, is incredible attractiveness. And then it also suggests this different view of us, because when you think, well, my really strong desires are for base things, the pull of the fridge, the pull of the bedroom,
Mhm.
as you put it, uh, that suggests that what I am is kind of a lower creature. But to think that the strongest thing in me, and in the Course, is ultimately the source of all the other desires, they're all just distortions of it. So the only real desire in me is I want the most lofty thing there is. I want God. That is a much more noble view of our nature.
Yeah, I wonder if a better language would be there's the pull of God, and then there's just the impulses of the body. And because we experience ourselves in these bodies, those impulses are what we feel. But what's interesting about the pull of God is that it shows up. One of the things that's interesting about the pull of God is that it shows up in NDEs. It shows up in near death experiences, and Robert, you've created a collection of NDEs that use the language of pull, or actually even use the specific word pull. So, do you want to share one of those?
Yeah, well, I first want to just talk about the concept, and my collection isn't that long yet. I keep looking out for them. I should do more active searching, but when I stumble across one, I'll pull it into my list.
No
Um,
pun.
no pun, thank you. Um, anyway, the idea is really similar throughout, and what I love about this is that the exact thing the Course is talking about, people report experiencing in near-death experiences and certain kinds of other experiences. The template goes something like this. So someone's having an NDE and they feel like they've left their body, and oftentimes they start in a place of darkness. It's comfortable, comforting darkness, but it's still dark. And then they see this pinpoint of light in the distance, which initially is a curiosity. But what happens is they start to move closer to the light, and as they start moving closer to it, not only does the light grow, but they feel this pull towards it. They feel this incredible magnetism in which they're absolutely drawn, and they want nothing more in the world than to reach that light and be in that light. And that process typically culminates with them being engulfed by the light and having a sense of uniting with it. But what's so interesting is these people don't have an awareness of this teaching in the Course. Course students aren't aware of this teaching in the Course. And yet the
You stole
match,
my joke.
oh, sorry.
It's
And
like it's
yet,
not only that people who have NDEs aren't aware, we're not aware, course students aren't aware either.
right,
Yeah.
but the match is perfect.
Hmm.
So we've got a couple of these. I thought you were going to read the first one. Is that right?
Yeah, I'll read the first one. This one is from Manuela Fazzi. And what is said is, quote, I noticed a light, small at first, but which grew as I closed in on it due to this pulling force. I was pulled towards this light and sort of dissolved into it. I lost sense of my physical bounds, and that pull that I had felt opened my heart. It felt like a massive exchange of pure love, an explosion of emotions to which one completely surrenders and into which one dissolves. It is impossible to put this into words because of its inexpressibly beautiful quality.
Hmm. And I have a favorite. I stumbled upon it very recently from a woman who's a YouTuber named Melissa Denise. And she actually has some YouTube videos on the course, but I don't think she's aware of this connection. She had a pre-birth memory, a memory of a state before birth that wasn't an NDE, but the content's very similar. So here's her account. As soon as you see the light, it instantly becomes about desire. The only thought in your mind is getting to that light. It is extremely magnetic, and there's the quality of attraction. It is all you can think about. And as you get closer to the light, and as you come into the light, there are waves of love and peace and bliss. It is, she says, excruciating ecstasy. It is the source and satisfaction of everything that you could ever want. And then she closes with, and you cannot think outside of it. And I love that line. Like, you
Yeah.
cannot think. What is it? What would it mean? Because we don't know that experience in this world. We can think outside of everything here.
Hmm.
We have a hard time keeping our mind on any one thing. We're always thinking outside of things. So what would it be like to have something so completely attractive and engulfing that you cannot think outside of it?
Yeah. I love that line, excruciating ecstasy as well, because it feels like, excruciating isn't a word that we always associate as the
Mm-hmm.
positive, but
Mm-hmm.
ecstasy, so what a concept. And thinking outside of it, you can't think outside of it. It's an amazing idea as well, because being able to think outside of God is what causes all of our suffering in this world, or
Yeah,
at
and if
least.
we only knew that we're
Mhm.
so attracted to him that when we're with him, we can't think outside of him.
And it's excruciating ecstasy. Well, it sounds amazing. I mean, it almost makes me want to have an NDE almost to experience this excruciating ecstasy as Melissa described it. But if it is so irresistible, then why aren't we more in touch with it here? Why aren't we more in touch with this pull of God in these bodies?
It's a really good question. And the course, the different references to the pole ultimately give this whole picture. We'll just give parts of it. But at the base of it, we're afraid of it. And we're afraid of it because we think it will uproot us and sweep us away from ourselves. So in the very first chapter of the course, he refers to, quote, a pull which you recognize is so intense that you are afraid. You think you'll be uprooted. Now, when you think about that idea, like it's like we're a tree rooted in the ground, okay? And that's our existence. If we're uprooted, what becomes of us? So it feels like this pull is so intense that it will actually uproot us. And as a later passage says, we'll be swept away from ourselves. That is an existential fear. And so if there's something so attractive that we're afraid it will do that to us, we'll want to cover it up.
Yeah. So we're so afraid of it that we cover it up and we repress it as well. So there's a line in the course that says, quote, repression thus operates to conceal not only the baser impulses, but also the most lofty ones from the ego's awareness, because both are equally threatening to the ego. So we don't want to get so sucked into the ego that we go into a life of crime, for example, but we also don't want to get so lofty with God that we feel like we're going to be too woo-woo. And that's a real concern for a lot of students on the spiritual path. They don't want to succumb to that pull of God, even if they may be feeling it, because they're afraid it's going to make them too woo-woo, the lofty impulse. And so we push it down and repress it and repress it. And the Course echoes that as well.
Right. And the way repression works is when you repress something, it's unavailable to your consciousness. So
Mm-hmm.
you aren't feeling it anymore. And along these lines, a couple things come to my mind. One is I had a friend years ago who got a hold of some meditation tapes, went into this kind of higher state of consciousness that very much involved God. And she had this fear that she was just going to walk away from her apartment, walk away from her job, and just go off into the forest to be with God. And what happens to your life then? And another story that I think of is there was a guy who actually, he ended his life teaching in Sedona to a small group of students, but he was a devotee. His name was Robert Adams. He's a devotee of Ramana Maharshi in India. And when he first encountered Ramana Maharshi, he'd come to Arunachala, the mountain where Maharshi was, and he had come there to see him, but he was just walking on the mountain and happened to see Maharshi a little ways off. And what he did was he just threw off all his clothes and prostrated before Maharshi's feet. Not like as a planned thing, not really as even a particularly conscious thing. And you think, oh my God, what if I did something? What if I was so carried away with my attraction for God and what we're talking about that we did crazy things like that? We left our jobs, walked off into the forest, chucked our clothes off like St. Francis of Assisi. What might happen to our lives? So we are afraid of being carried away, basically.
Mhm. Right.
Okay, yeah. Is there more you
So,
want to say about that?
I find it hard to believe that we would ever go the throwing our clothes off and prostrating route. Maybe some would. I can't imagine that's too much of a concern for many of us.
Well, I'm
Uh,
not saying it's a concern. I'm saying that we're afraid somewhere inside that if we let this in, like we've all seen people who have desires and impulses that are so strong that they do things
well,
that kind of take their lives down.
I can well, I hear you on that. And we've talked about the ways in which when the Holy Spirit comes in to your life, get ready, because you can be told, you're guided rather, to make decisions that would otherwise seem very out of character. If you would have told me 10 years ago that I would be working for a small, funky nonprofit based in Sedona, um, I would have laughed. But such is the Holy Spirit's influence on our life, and so we do push back from that. And when you and I first met in 2016, 2017, I said to you that I was afraid of becoming too woo-woo as a result of just completely devoting my life to God. And and you said, I don't think that you'll become more woo-woo, I think you'll become more real. And and on one hand, I absolutely see that that has happened. I do feel far more real. And on the other hand, I have lost a lot of friends who were in my life before because they think that I'm too woo-woo. um, so there is a real kind of feels like a cost to devoting ourselves to the giving ourselves over to that pull of God
I
that we're
think
afraid of.
I think there's a recognition that at the extreme ends, you kind of start to move outside the conventions of society. Like society is built for protection against the baseness of the ego, right? Society, if our egos took over, we couldn't even have society. So society makes sure it doesn't happen. But on the other end of the spectrum, you also start to move outside the conventions of society in terms of, when you give in to the pull of God. So we have Jesus, who was executed by the state. His society killed him because he was at the other end of the spectrum, moving so far outside conventions that members of society that were in charge felt he was a threat.
Right. That's what I was trying to say earlier, where we have the baser impulses where if we just succumb to them, we're just setting ourselves up for a life of crime, because all we're going to do is go around trying to achieve our personal desires in ways that we're probably not going to be proud of. And then on the other side, we've got the giving our lives to God completely, where we associate that with, if not getting naked and prostrating in front of a spiritual guru, becoming a monk, right, or something like that. Or
Right.
God's going to ask you to run a nonprofit, and you're not that kind of thing. So we have the protections against that, right? So we have our
Right.
fear, we have repression, and the course also talks about something it calls reaction formation. So do you want to talk about that, how we use reaction formation to protect against this pull of God?
Yeah, reaction formation is a Freudian concept, a Freudian term, and it's where there's something in you that you don't like and it scares you. And so you put on the conscious level, you put on the guise of being the opposite of that. Okay. And so let's say, for instance, that you really can't stand a stinginess in your nature. So you might put on a guise of being a super generous person to give the impression that that thing that you don't like is not in you. Or, classic case is homophobia. You may feel homosexual tendencies and be so afraid of them that on the conscious level, you put on the guise of someone who's the absolute opposite. You're a man's man and you hate gay people. Um, and so what he says early on is that when he was talking to Helen and Bill in particular, when they have this pose of doubting God and wishing they believed more, what's really going on is they aren't really doubters. They aren't really, um, kind of weak believers. They are actually, they have the pull and they feel this pull and they're afraid of it. They're afraid of being swept away. And so on the conscious level, they protect against it by saying, "Oh, I don't know, I just don't believe. And I just feel full of doubt. And I wish I wasn't so full of doubt." That's the pose that they were using to protect themselves from the pull. Isn't that
Yeah,
fascinating?
yeah, it is fascinating. And I always see reaction formation at work in people who are extremely nice. Like they just go out of
Mm,
their way to be like sickly sweet, right?
mm-hmm.
And on one hand, you want to benefit from it because who doesn't want to be around nice people? But also, I've seen and you've seen that can also be a cover for intense anger. And so it's using being overly nice to cover what's really going on, which is that anger. So this is something that we
Yeah.
see all the time.
That's a really good application of reaction formation. It's really interesting. And I think you're right. But to bring it back to the whole pull of God thing, like, what do we say on the conscious level? Well, I wish I wanted God more. And I just have a hard time totally believing in God. And I feel like I wish I desired him more. If he seems kind of boring. What if that's all a pose that we are using to protect ourselves from the pull of God? Wouldn't that be interesting?
Yeah, yeah, it would. It's one of those things where the course is when someone is attacking you or in that space of where you feel like they're coming at you, what you're supposed to see is a brother who wants to be your friend. And so if someone is saying, well, I'm just not feeling attracted to God, I'm not, this God is boring or this God is vengeful or I'm not into this whole spiritual scene, what if they're really saying underneath, I have this deep seated attraction to God and my words are just my guard against it. So
Yeah.
hmm.
And I think I've known people for whom that's really true, where they feel the pull on some level and they don't want to feel it. And so they
Yeah,
turn into atheists.
right. Well, we get a lot of that here at the circle where folks will come in because they feel the pull, but then it's like, oh, this is too much, too much pull on their side, and they
Hmm.
and they go out, and so that happens. The circle kind of breathes people in that way.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Just to go add on to this idea of how we defend ourselves against it, we're talking about some fairly normal human things here, but the Course sees it in ultimately much larger terms. It says we've built this entire world to cover up our attraction to God. This is from chapter 13, the text. He says, "You think you have made a world which God would destroy, and by loving him, which you do, you would throw this world away, which you would. Therefore, you have used the world to cover your love." Now, obviously, talking about, an overwhelming attraction to God, attraction and love are, virtually the same idea. So when he says you've used the world to cover your love, he's saying you've used the world to cover the pull. This whole world was built to keep a lid on that overwhelming pull.
We just did a psychotherapy supplement series, and I think you know that one of the lines that I've pulled from that is only patients come here.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as I mentioned in our Sunday gathering, I've been threatening to do T-shirts for the circle that says, "Of course it's bad, only patients come here." And so, if you can kind of keep that in mind, that this body itself was made to hide from God, to resist our overwhelming pull towards Him, then a lot of things make sense.
A lot of things make sense. Yeah.
So let's talk about the upshot of all of this. What are we supposed to do with what we've learned so far about the pull of God?
Well, I mean, you could say all kinds of things about the practical upshot of this, but I think that for me, the the big picture is to realize that this pull is innate in our minds. The Course talks about it as the moving force in what it calls the superconscious mind. And as such, has been blocked out of the conscious mind, but it's always trying to get in. And little tendrils of it get in, and distorted forms of it get in, and diluted forms of it get in. And I think what I would say is the practical upshot is to realize that those little bits of desire for God are authentic. They're not phony. They're not just instilled in us by religion or something. Um, and that they are the little tiny echoes of something that is titanic in us. And as such, we should realize that by obeying those little impulses for God, we are obeying our own true will. We're obeying something very authentic in us and something that is ultimately titanic in us. So when we feel the pull to sit down and meditate, we should obey it. When we feel the pull to pray, we should obey that. All these different things that ultimately get us closer to God, we should realize that we're not just doing what some book tells us to do. We're not just
Mhm.
doing what church tells us to do or society tells us to do. We're obeying something in us that is very deep and very authentic in us.
Yeah, another name for the pull in the Course is eternal fixation. And what I find so inspiring about that is similar to what's exactly what you're saying. We are eternally fixated on God. We are eternally, there's some part of us that's eternally obsessed with God. And despite how we tend to view fixations, like human fixations, are they go up and down all the time. We're obsessed with something one day, we're not obsessed with it the next. But to be eternally fixated on God means that we never lose that. Like we can never go back from that. There's something in us that's always pointing us towards the direction of God. And I find that to be a truly inspiring idea. And what's also inspiring about it is the ego in our mind always, it feels like it has the upper hand. There's so often throughout the day we feel like the ego is winning, when what the Course assures us and what the pull of God means is that there's always a power in our mind that's bigger than the ego, and that power, because it's of God, is always going to win in the end. And so we don't have to worry about the ego being the dominant force in our mind. It never
Mm-hmm.
has been, and it never will be, regardless of how dominant it appears to be.
That's a really important kind of shift in how we see things. Because it looks like, I mean, to the extent that we're honest with ourselves, it can feel like the ego is just ruling the roost.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, from the Course's standpoint, the ego is terrified. There's a place, I think it's in chapter 4, where it says the ego basically feels opposed by literally invincible odds. whether you are awake or asleep. It feels like the underdog because it is. This pull is titanic and the ego is tiny.
Hmm. Along that line, did you want me to read the last paragraph of the eternal fixation section in the course?
I love that paragraph, and it really brings the whole pull idea down to a kind of a more emotional level.
Yeah, this is where it's one of those like lofty passages in the course that's really beautiful. Incidentally, this paragraph is in the CE in the eternal fixation section in, is it chapter 5? It's a chapter
Mhm,
5, right?
mhm.
And everything prior to this paragraph was cut from the FIP, but this section remains, and it's in both versions of the course. It's really stunning, and this is it. Do you really think, sorry, do you really believe you can make a voice which can drown out his? Do you really believe you can devise a thought system which can separate you from his? Do you really believe that you can plan for your safety and joy better than he can? You need be neither careful nor careless. You need merely cast all your cares upon him because he careth for you. You are his care because he loves you. His voice reminds you always that all hope is yours because of his care. You cannot choose to escape his care because that is not his will. But you can choose to accept his care and use the infinite power of his care for all of those he created by it.
I love that
Yeah,
paragraph.
because it just says it all, right? It says the ego's not going to win. Like, do you really think you can make a voice that can drown out his? Good luck with that.
Yeah. Yeah, and it also says that that pull is the pull to be inside God's care. Like I think as spiritual students, we don't associate the word care much with God, right? We associate love and peace with God, but we don't think of God as caring and as kind of just lavishing his care upon us. And in this passage, that's what we're pulled back to, is that state where we're under his care. And it even says that he created us by his care, which is an interesting concept.
Hmm. Yeah. So if his care is going to win in the end, why we resisted so much?
Yeah, and I think that's almost the big punchline here. And there's a couple of passages that say that I think we should read. Um, but what he keeps saying is this pull is irresistible, which means you literally cannot resist it. In the end, it will get the better of you. So why keep trying to resist it? I think we all know that experience where there's certain pulls in us where we think, yep, I can resist this. And in the end you go, oh, what was I thinking? I can't.
Yeah,
You
you're like
know,
faces in the refrigerator in the middle of the night.
exactly. And you're just
Yeah.
thinking, it got the better of me. And it was, of course it would get the better of me. And that's how we should think of this pull. Like, of course it will get the better of me in the end. Why do I keep resisting? So one of the passages that I want to read is from the eternal fixation section. He says, you were eternally fixated on God in your creation, and the pull of this fixation is so strong that you will never overcome it. The reason is perfectly clear. The fixation is on a level which is so high that it cannot be surmounted. It's so high you can't get over it, above it. You are always being pulled back to your Creator because you belong in Him. That's a great line. You are always being pulled back to your Creator because you belong in Him. So that's one passage that says it. And then early in the first paragraph of chapter 2 in the CE says something very similar. Another great passage. He says fear of possession, so fear of being possessed, and that can be by like demons or it can be like spouses. we seem to be possessed by a lot of things in this world, and that section talks about those things. Fear of possession is a perverted expression of the fear of the irresistible, excuse me, irresistible attraction of God. The truth is still that the attraction of God is irresistible at all levels, and the acceptance of this totally unavoidable truth is only a matter of time. So you can see that he has this concept in different passages, and it is, I think, like the best punchline,
Mhm.
because if the pull is so strong that you can't resist it, then it's gonna have its way with us in the end. Why keep resisting it now? Why not just yield to it?
Yeah, and that language of yield to it is, it's a subtle difference than the way we tend to think about the two voices in our head, like the ego and the Holy Spirit. If we follow the Holy Spirit, we're yielding to the pull. And when I was preparing my Sunday gathering talk, I was talking about this idea of choosing the pull. And you and I were saying, well, the language is yielding to, and that's a subtle but powerful difference. So if you're choosing something, you're choosing something that's outside of you. If you're yielding to something, you're yielding to something that's within. And so when we think about the choice that we have in our own mind, we can choose the voice of the Holy Spirit, or sorry, we can choose the voice of the ego, or we can yield to the voice of the Holy Spirit, which is the pull of God in us. And so what I like about that is that it just feels easier. It just feels like, okay, well, if I'm just yielding to something that's already in me, then it's not a hard decision, right? Like I don't have to kind of hike up to something. It's just I have to yield to what's already there. And I think that's a beautiful idea.
Yeah, you know what comes to my mind is the example of conversion therapy. You know, the idea that you can take people who are gay by nature, you know, from birth, and just like convert them to something that they're not. And the notion there is if you just keep making the choice for this thing that you're not, even though everything in you goes against it, you can do it, you can get there. Well, we know you can't, right? And so what the course is saying is don't think of the choice for God in those terms. Like everything in you is saying something else, but just keep choosing, you know, and you can get there. Rather, it's saying yield to your nature, yield to the natural impulse in you, and that natural impulse is to be with God.
Right. And that has a spillover effect to everything about how we practice the course. So you and I are in the workbook this year. And so if we think of a practice period, for example, as something that we are just choosing to do because we're being good spiritual students, that's so different than thinking, I'm just going to yield to this natural impulse in me because it's the only thing that I really want anyway.
Yeah.
And I love thinking about it that way. And I think if we could get in that mode, it would be easier to do practice periods, for example. They wouldn't seem like something so difficult.
Yeah. It's very different than thinking, you know, my natural impulses are in this one direction towards the ego, towards the world, but I'll make the good choice anyway.
Right. To me, that's it. Like it's the difference between so many students are thinking, and I've put myself in this camp too. It's like I need to do this thing because I'm trying to be a good spiritual student. And that makes the choice harder, right? And
Yeah.
so if you just say, I can't wait to sit down and do this meditation because I am just yielding to this pull of God within me, it's a completely different mindset. So
Yeah.
I know we've
One
got
last
to
thing before
go
we
ahead.
go, I want to just emphasize how important it is that how important the different vision of God contained in the pull of God idea is. One of my favorite New Testament scholars, who's since passed on, Marcus Borg, he said that the way you envision God, the way that you envision whatever is ultimate, determines so much of your whole stance in life, emotionally and mentally. So he talked about three ways of envisioning God. You can envision God as wrathful and fearful. if you see God that way, that affects your whole life. You can see God as neutral and basically uninterested. If you see God that way, he doesn't care about you. It's not scary, but you're on your own, and that's scary in itself. And that's kind of how we feel so much about God in spiritual circles. Like he's there, but he's kind of not interested in us. He has a neutral feeling towards us. Um, he's the impersonal God. But he said you also can see God as friendly and loving and caring. And that too gives you a different stance in life. And the pull of God idea, I think, sort of puts some high octane rocket fuel in the friendly, loving God concept, because to think that we have this unbelievable, irresistible attraction to God that's so powerful, it actually scares us, because God is something that we find so desirable. That gives us a different stance in life.
Yeah. And that's I feel like that's a whole other podcast. And we did a podcast on what is God, and a workshop on reconnecting with God. And I wish we had more time to
Yeah.
get further into that, because when we talk about being pulled towards God, then it's important to understand what kind of God we're being pulled to. And a lot of people are running from God right now. They're running from that vengeful God. And to some degree, it's not that they're running from an impersonal God, but as we've been saying, it just feels very bland. An impersonal God makes for a rather bland spiritual experience, at least in my view.
But
So
if you have an overwhelming pull towards God and find him therefore irresistibly attractive, that says something automatically about God. You don't find, wrathful deities unbelievably attractive, right?
right, yeah. So the Course's view of an unconditionally loving God who loves absolutely everyone equally, and no one can ever lose perfection in his eyes, and no one can ever lose the quality of his care. That's a God that you want to be pulled toward. That's the kind of God that is worthy of our unconditional
That's the kind of God
attraction
that
toward.
that naturally inspires attraction.
Yeah. Okay. So we gotta go here. So did you want me to read one last NDE?
Why not? Why not
Okay.
read one last one and have us all just imagine that this awaits us personally.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good way to frame it. So this one is from Diane Sherman, and she is recounting her NDE experience. And she says, as it starts to grow, meaning a light, as it starts to grow, I can't take my attention off of it because it's what I'm drawn to now. And as it grows and starts to encompass more of the space where the darkness was, I'm feeling this pull, pulling me forward into it. I'm feeling this pull from in front of me into this glimmer of light. And all of a sudden, it starts to grow, and everything is illuminated in this light, including me. And I'm overwhelmed by the feeling, a feeling of such joy and overwhelming ecstasy being in this illumination of light. What a concept to think we can have that in our each and every day, that we can get in touch with this as our ultimate reality. And as I was saying in the Sunday gathering message, if we can get in touch with this as our ultimate reality, we wouldn't be what the language you've used is such careful engineers of our own safety, right? We would just yield to this pull, yield to the Holy Spirit within us, trust that it can run our lives better than we can, and live more happier lives as a result.
Yeah, it's a great concept, and I'm glad it's in the course now, and I hope people become more and more aware of it.
Yeah, well, thank you, Robert, for all that you've done to pull out the pull of God in the course. We appreciate it, and I know we'll be talking more about this topic in the coming weeks, months, and years ahead. Thanks for joining us, everyone who is here live. We really appreciate it. We plan to record these live podcasts every Tuesday moving forward at 11 a.m. Eastern. So we plan to record every week. And if you'd like to join the list and be notified so that you can join us live as well on Tuesdays at 11, there's no charge. Just go to circleofa.org/events and you'll find the sign up there. Thank you so much for joining us for Exploring A Course in Miracles. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.